I was heading out at dawn with my snow machine and grooming drag when I saw her standing at the end of my driveway like some kind of encrusted guardian of suburban misery. The woman wore a designer parka that probably cost more than my entire grooming setup, and her expression suggested she had been personally offended by my existence. I killed the engine and pulled off my helmet, already knowing this was going to be one of those conversations. Living in the Whitefish Ridge development outside of Kalispell, Montana, had its perks, but the HOA was not one of them. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the fact that it was barely 6 in the morning and I had a 10-mile trail system waiting for maintenance. "I'm Barbara Hutchinson, president of the Whitefish Ridge Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I did not already know exactly who she was. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Barbara. She was the woman who had tried to fine the Millers for planting the wrong shade of green shrubs. "And I need to speak with you about your unauthorized activities." I climbed off my snow machine, noting the grooming drag attached behind it. The drag was a beauty, a homemade contraption I had welded together over several weekends using old bed frames and weighted with sandbags. It packed down the snow and created a smooth surface perfect for snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, and winter hiking. For the past 3 years, I had been maintaining the trail system that ran through the national forest adjacent to our development. "What unauthorized activities would those be, Barbara?" "This." She gestured dramatically at my snow machine and drag. "You've been grooming trails on HOA property without permission. Multiple residents have complained about the noise and the unsightly tracks you're leaving everywhere." I felt my jaw clench. "I'm not grooming trails on HOA property. I'm maintaining the national forest trails that connect to the development. The Forest Service knows all about it. I've been doing this as volunteer work for years." "Those trails originate from our property," Barbara insisted, pulling out a folder that she had apparently been hiding in her enormous parka. "According to the HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4, no resident may operate commercial equipment for business purposes within the development boundaries. This includes your snow machine grooming operation. It's not a business, it's volunteer work. That's irrelevant." "The bylaws clearly state." "I know what the bylaws state, Barbara. I read them when I moved in 5 years ago. This doesn't apply because I'm not running a business and I'm primarily working on federal land, not HOA property. I just happen to live here." Her face was reddening now, visible even in the weak dawn light. "The board has voted unanimously to ban your grooming activities, effective immediately. If you continue, you'll face daily fines of $500. My name is Henry Whitmore, and I had lived in Montana for 15 years, having moved from Seattle after deciding that city life was slowly killing my soul. I had worked as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company in Kalispell, and my weekends were devoted to the outdoors. The trail grooming had started as a casual hobby, something to do with my snow machine besides just riding around aimlessly. But it had grown into something more meaningful. The local community had come to depend on those groomed trails. Cross-country skiers, snowshoers, families with kids on sleds, even dog walkers used them throughout the winter. "You can't fine me for activities conducted on federal land," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "We can and we will fine you for the disturbance to the community. Early morning noise complaints, the eyesore of your equipment stored visibly in your driveway, and the traffic you're encouraging through our neighborhood. All of these violate our community standards." I glanced back at my driveway. My snow machine sat there, yes, but it was neatly positioned beside my garage, not blocking anything. The grooming drag was currently attached, but normally I stored it in my backyard. As for traffic, the trails access the national forest from multiple points. My house was not some kind of trailhead hub. This is ridiculous, Barbara. The board's decision is final. You have until this weekend to cease all grooming activities or the fines will begin. You'll receive formal documentation by end of day. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her car, a gleaming white SUV that had probably never seen an actual dirt road. I stood there in my driveway, watching the sun slowly brighten the sky over the mountains, feeling my morning completely derailed. 3 years of work maintaining those trails. 3 years of early mornings and late evenings, of dragging grooming equipment through sometimes brutal conditions, of coordinating with the Forest Service ranger station to make sure I was hitting the trails that needed the most attention. And now Barbara and her board of suburban dictators wanted to shut it all down because of noise complaints and aesthetic concerns. I pulled out my phone and called the Flathead National Forest Ranger Station. It was early, but I knew Dave Morrison would already be there. Dave was the district ranger, a weathered guy in his 50s who had worked for the Forest Service for decades. He had been my main contact for the volunteer grooming program. "Morrison," he answered on the third ring. "Dave, it's Henry Whitmore. We've got a problem." I explained the situation while pacing in my driveway, my breath creating clouds in the cold air. Dave listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated about him. "So let me get this straight," Dave said when I finished. "Your HOA is trying to ban you from grooming trails on federal land because they don't like the noise. That's the gist of it. They're threatening fines of $500 per day if I continue. Can they even do that? You're not operating on their property." "I have no idea. I'm not a lawyer, but Barbara seems convinced they have the authority." Dave was quiet for a moment. "Look, Henry, those trails you've been maintaining are critical infrastructure for our winter recreation program. Since you started grooming them, we've seen a huge increase in usage, which is exactly what we want. You're providing a service that would cost us tens of thousands of dollars if we had to contract it out. Is there any way to work with this HOA?" "I don't think Barbara Hutchinson is interested in working with anyone. She's interested in control." "Yeah, I've met that type before. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to draft a formal letter of appreciation for your volunteer work, outlining exactly what you do for the Forest Service and why it's important. Maybe that'll carry some weight with your HOA. I'll also document that you're operating under our volunteer program, which is completely legal and encouraged. If they want to fight the Forest Service, that's a different battle." "I appreciate that, Dave. Don't thank me yet. These HOA things can get messy. I've seen it before with other volunteers in different districts. Property rights get weird when you're dealing with people who think they own the whole neighborhood." After hanging up with Dave, I stood there trying to decide what to do. I had trails to groom. People were counting on them being maintained, but I also did not want to rack up thousands of dollars in HOA fines that might actually be enforceable. Regardless of where I was physically operating, my phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor, Frank Palmer. "Heard Barbara ambushed you this morning." "What's going on?" Frank lived 3 doors down and was one of the main people who used the groomed trails. He was an avid cross-country skier and had often thanked me for the maintenance work. I called him back instead of texting. "Barbara and the board are banning my grooming activities. Threatening fines. That's insane. Those trails are the best thing about living out here. Tell that to Barbara. Half the neighborhood uses those trails, Henry. People love them. Apparently not everyone. She said there were multiple complaints." Frank made a disgusted sound. Multiple complaints probably means her and maybe two of her friends on the board. Most people don't even know there's an issue. Is there going to be a board meeting about this? She didn't mention one. Just said the decision was final. That doesn't sound right. Major decisions are supposed to go through a vote at a general meeting, not just a board decision. Let me check the bylaws. After talking with Frank, I decided to go ahead with my grooming run. The Forest Service supported me, and I was operating on federal land. If Barbara wanted to fine me, she would have to prove that what I was doing actually violated the HOA rules, and I was not convinced she could. The trail system was in rough shape after the storm we had gotten 3 days earlier. Nearly 18 inches of fresh powder had fallen, which was great for the ski resorts but made the trails almost impassable without grooming. I spent the next 5 hours dragging my equipment through the network, packing down the snow and creating smooth corridors through the forest. Around 11, I passed 3 different groups of skiers, all of whom waved and shouted thanks. An older couple on snowshoes stopped me to chat about how much they appreciated the trail maintenance. A family with 2 young kids on a sled told me their children looked forward to their weekend trail walks all week. These were the moments that made the early mornings and cold fingers worthwhile. This was why I did this work. By the time I got back home, it was past noon and I was exhausted. Grooming was physical work, requiring constant attention to the drag, adjustments for terrain, and navigation through sometimes tricky forest conditions. I parked my snow machine in the driveway, detached the grooming drag, and hauled it to my backyard for storage. A formal letter was taped to my front door. The Whitefish Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead was embossed at the top, making it look official and vaguely threatening. I ripped it open and read while standing on my porch. The letter detailed exactly what Barbara had told me that morning, but with more formal language and specific citations of HOA bylaws. Operation of commercial equipment, noise disturbances, creation of unauthorized traffic patterns, and storage of unsightly equipment were all listed as violations. The fine structure was laid out clearly. $500 per day for continued violations, with the possibility of additional legal action if the behavior persisted. At the bottom, 3 signatures: Barbara Hutchinson, HOA President; Donna Sheffield, HOA Vice President; Richard Turner, HOA Treasurer. I went inside and made myself lunch, my mind churning through options. The letter claimed authority it might not actually have, but fighting it would require time and probably money for a lawyer. The easier path would be to just stop grooming and let the trails go to hell. But that felt wrong. Those trails served the community, both inside the development and beyond. Giving up because Barbara was on a power trip went against everything I believed in. My phone rang. Unknown number with a Montana area code. This is Henry. Mr. Whitmore, this is Jennifer Santos from the Forest Service Regional Office in Missoula. Dave Morrison asked me to give you a call regarding your volunteer trail grooming work. I sat up straighter. The regional office was serious business. Yes, thanks for calling. Dave filled me in on your situation with your homeowners association. I want you to know that the Forest Service considers your volunteer work to be extremely valuable. The trails you maintain in the Flathead National Forest are part of our designated winter recreation system, and your grooming has significantly enhanced public access and safety. I appreciate that. More than appreciation, Mr. Whitmore. We want to formalize your volunteer status. I'm preparing documentation that officially designates you as a Forest Service volunteer under our National Volunteer Program. This comes with certain protections and authorities. It also means that any interference with your volunteer work could potentially be considered interference with federal activities. That caught my attention. What does that mean practically? It means your HOA would be on very shaky legal ground trying to prevent you from performing officially sanctioned federal volunteer work. It doesn't give you unlimited authority, obviously. They can still enforce reasonable rules about noise levels, storage of equipment on your private property, things like that. But they cannot prevent you from accessing federal land to perform volunteer maintenance work, even if that access happens to pass through their development. Would that hold up if they tried to fine me? I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, but I've been with the Forest Service for 20 years, and I've seen situations like this before. Generally, federal authority supersedes local homeowner association rules when it comes to activities on federal land. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over what happens in the national forest. The question would be whether they can prove your activities constitute a violation that occurs specifically on their property, not on federal land. We talked for another 15 minutes, with Jennifer explaining the formal volunteer process and what documentation I would receive. She also mentioned that the Forest Service might be able to provide a small stipend for equipment maintenance and fuel, which was unexpected but welcome. After hanging up, I felt marginally better about the situation. At least I had institutional backing from the federal government. But I also knew that Barbara was not the type to back down easily. This was going to get uglier before it got better. The weekend arrived without any further communication from the HOA, which I took as a bad sign. Barbara was plotting something. Frank had sent me a copy of the HOA bylaws with several sections highlighted, pointing out that major decisions affecting community amenities were supposed to require a vote of all homeowners, not just the board. The Groom trails, he argued, had become a community amenity over the past 3 years, which meant shutting them down should require community input. I went out Saturday morning to Groom, determined not to let Barbara's threats change my routine. The trails needed maintenance after another night of light snow, and I had committed to this work. When I returned home around 10, Barbara was waiting in my driveway again. But this time she was not alone. She had brought Donna Sheffield and Richard Turner, the other 2 board members who had signed the letter. All 3 of them stood like a wall of suburban disapproval. "Mr. Whitmore, you were specifically instructed to cease your grooming activities," Barbara said as I shut off my snow machine. "I was specifically instructed that I would face fines. I have not ceased anything because I'm performing legal volunteer work on federal land." "You're violating HOA rules." "No, I'm not. I'm accessing federal land to perform volunteer maintenance work sanctioned by the Forest Service. What I do on federal property is none of the HOA's business." Donna stepped forward. She was younger than Barbara, probably early 40s, with the kind of severe haircut that suggested she had asked for the manager before even entering the salon. "You're creating a disturbance to the community. Multiple residents have complained about your early morning departures. Name one resident besides yourselves." The 3 of them exchanged glances. "Privacy concerns prevent us from disclosing," Barbara started. "Right. So you can't actually name anyone because there are no complaints. You 3 just don't like that I'm doing something without asking your permission." Richard finally spoke up. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who always wore expensive outdoor gear despite never actually going outdoors. "The board has authority to enforce community standards. Your activities fall below those standards. My activities involve maintaining public trails that benefit this community and the broader public. I've received official recognition from the Forest Service for this work. I'm not running a business. I'm not causing actual disturbances beyond normal residential activities, and I'm not violating any reasonable interpretation of the bylaws. The fine schedule begins Monday, Barbara said coldly. $500 per day that you continue these activities. You'll receive invoices weekly. Invoice me all you want. I'm not paying fines for legal activities conducted on federal land. Then we'll place a lien on your property. That was the nuclear option, and hearing Barbara say it so casually made my blood run cold. HOAs had the legal authority to place liens on properties for unpaid fines and fees. If they actually went through with it, I could potentially lose my house over this absurd dispute. You're really willing to destroy a neighbor's life over trail grooming? I asked, genuinely incredulous. We're willing to enforce community standards, Barbara replied. If you choose not to comply, that's your decision. They left, piling into Barbara's white SUV like a clown car of bureaucratic petness. I stood in my driveway, feeling the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. This was not just about trails anymore. This was about whether I could keep my home. Frank came over that evening with a bottle of whiskey and moral support. We sat in my living room while I explained the morning's confrontation. They can't actually put a lien on your house for this, Frank said, though he sounded less certain than I would have liked. They can if I refuse to pay HOA-imposed fines. Whether those fines are legitimate is a legal question that would require a lawyer to fight. Then get a lawyer. Do you know how much lawyers cost? I could spend thousands of dollars fighting this, and even if I win, I'm out that money. Barbara knows that. She's counting on me not being able to afford the legal fight. Frank poured us both another glass. There has to be something we can do. Most of the neighborhood supports what you're doing, even if they don't know it's under attack. Maybe that's the angle. If we can show that the community actually wants the grooming to continue, it might undermine Barbara's position. How do we do that? Petition. Survey. Something to document community support. Frank pulled out his phone and started typing. I'll draft something tonight and start circulating it tomorrow. We'll go door to door if we have to. The next week was a strange kind of standoff. I continued grooming the trails every other day, maintaining the schedule I had kept for 3 years. Barbara sent me daily emails documenting my violations and accumulating fines. By Friday, according to her accounting, I owed $2,500 to the HOA. Frank's petition, meanwhile, was gathering signatures. He had enlisted his wife, Margaret, and several other neighbors to canvass the development. By Wednesday, they had signatures from 47 households supporting the trail grooming and opposing the HOA's ban. Whitefish Ridge had 73 total households, which meant they had captured a significant majority of the community. Dave Morrison sent me the formal Forest Service documentation, a beautifully printed certificate naming me as an official volunteer with their winter trail maintenance program. It came with a letter from Jennifer Santos explaining my role and the importance of the work. He also sent a separate letter addressed to the HOA, cordially informing them that interfering with Forest Service volunteer activities could constitute a federal issue. I sent both documents to Barbara via certified mail, along with a letter explaining that I would not be paying any fines and that I would continue my volunteer work as authorized by the federal government. I also mentioned, as politely as possible, that attempting to place a lien on my property for activities conducted on federal land would likely result in legal consequences for the HOA board. Barbara's response arrived 2 days later. The HOA was calling an emergency general meeting for all homeowners to address ongoing violations of community standards and unauthorized activities. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at 10 in the morning at the community clubhouse. The clubhouse was a modest building at the center of the development, used mainly for occasional social events and board meetings. It had a large main room that could hold maybe 100 people if everyone squeezed in. When I arrived on Saturday morning, the parking lot was already full. Inside, nearly every chair was occupied. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I saw regularly but rarely spoke with beyond waves and brief greetings. Frank had saved me a seat near the front. He gave me a thumbs up as I sat down. Barbara stood at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by Donna and Richard. She had a stack of papers in front of her and wore the expression of someone preparing for battle. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Barbara began, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced pleasantness that politicians and HOA presidents seem to master. "We're here to discuss serious violations of our community bylaws by one of our residents, violations that threaten the character and tranquility of our neighborhood." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw several people glance my way. Henry Whitmore has been operating commercial grooming equipment from his residence, creating noise disturbances in the early morning hours, encouraging unauthorized traffic through our community, and generally conducting activities incompatible with our residential standards. The board has attempted to address this through official channels, but Mr. Whitmore has refused to comply with our directives. Frank stood up. "Point of order, Barbara. This is supposed to be a general meeting for community input, not a prosecution." Henry should have a chance to explain his side. Barbara's expression tightened. "Mr. Palmer, we're following proper procedure, are we?" Because proper procedure, according to Section 8 of the bylaws, requires that all homeowners be given a chance to speak on issues affecting community amenities. The trails Henry maintains have become a community amenity, which means we all get to weigh in. A woman I did not know well, Sandra Kim, stood up from the back. "I want to hear from Henry. I use those trails every weekend with my family. If they're going away, I want to know why." Barbara looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. "Very well. Mr. Whitmore, you may address the assembly." I stood up, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "Thanks, Barbara. I'll keep this simple. For the past 3 years, I've been volunteering my time and equipment to maintain winter trails in the Flathead National Forest adjacent to our development. This is not a business. I don't charge anyone, I don't make money from it, and I don't advertise services. I do this because I love the outdoors and because I believe in contributing to my community." I pulled out the Forest Service documents. The Flathead National Forest has officially recognized me as a volunteer in their winter recreation program. They've thanked me repeatedly for this work, which saves them tens of thousands of dollars in contractor fees and provides safe, maintained trails for public use. The trails I maintain are used by people from this neighborhood and beyond. Families with kids, cross-country skiers, snowshoers, even people just walking their dogs. The trails connect our community to public lands and enhance our quality of life. They're an asset, not a problem. Sandra spoke up again. "So why is the HOA trying to stop you?" "That's a question you should ask Barbara." All eyes turned to the front of the room. Barbara shuffled her papers. "The issue is not the trails themselves, but the manner in which Mr. Whitmore is conducting his activities. Early morning noise, unauthorized equipment, traffic patterns. What early morning noise?" someone called out. "I live next door to Henry and I barely hear him leave in the morning." That was Tim Rodriguez, my actual next-door neighbor. I had not even realized he was in the room. "My snow machine is no louder than anyone else's car starting up," I added. "I leave around 6 or 7 in the morning, which is perfectly reasonable. People leave for work earlier than that. Frank stood up again, holding up a sheaf of papers. I have a petition here signed by 47 households in this development supporting Henry's trail maintenance work and opposing the board's ban. That's nearly 2/3 of our community. This isn't about noise or traffic. This is about control. The room erupted in conversation. People were turning to their neighbors, discussing the situation, and I could see Barbara losing control of the narrative. Donna leaned over and whispered something to her urgently. Barbara banged a gavel on the podium, which I had not even known the HOA owned. "Order, please. The board has already made its decision based on bylaw violations. Today's meeting is simply to inform the community." "No, it's not," interrupted an older man I recognized as George Patterson. He was retired military, a stickler for rules and procedures. "According to our bylaws, the board cannot make unilateral decisions about community amenities without a general vote. Frank is right. If these trails have become an amenity, and clearly they have based on usage, then shutting them down requires community approval." "You don't have that approval, Barbara." "The trails are not an HOA amenity," Barbara argued. "They're on federal land." "They originate from our development," George countered. "They're accessed through our community. Residents view them as part of living here. That makes them functionally a community amenity, regardless of where they're physically located." Richard stood up, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should table this discussion and review the bylaws more carefully. Or perhaps we should vote right now," Frank said. "All in favor of allowing Henry to continue his volunteer trail maintenance work, raise your hand." Hands shot up all over the room. I tried to count but lost track after 50. It was overwhelming. The room was filled with support. All opposed, 3 hands: Barbara, Donna, and Richard. The room exploded in chatter and even some applause. I felt a weight lift off my chest that I had not realized was there. The community had spoken, clearly and decisively. Barbara looked like she had been slapped. "This is highly irregular. We need proper procedure." "The proper procedure just happened," George said firmly. "The community voted. Henry can continue his work. Board is overruled." The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations after that. People came up to me to express support, to thank me for the trails, to apologize that it had even become an issue. Several mentioned that they had not even known there was a problem until receiving notice of the emergency meeting. Sandra Kim waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching me. "My kids love those trails. We go out almost every Sunday. Thank you for fighting for this. Thank you for speaking up today." Barbara's had it out for anyone who doesn't fall in line since she became president. Most of us just avoid her, but someone needed to stand up eventually. Frank clapped me on the shoulder as we walked out to the parking lot. "That went better than I expected. You think Barbara will back down after that? She doesn't have a choice. The community shut her down hard." I wanted to believe him, but I had a feeling Barbara was not done yet. The following week was blissfully quiet. No emails from Barbara, no fines, no confrontations in my driveway. I groomed the trails on my regular schedule, and people continued using them. Several neighbors made a point of waving or stopping to chat when they saw me around the development. The general meeting seemed to have galvanized the community in an unexpected way. On Thursday, I received a call from Dave Morrison. "Henry, wanted to give you a heads up. We got a call from someone claiming to represent your HOA, asking about the legality of your volunteer work and whether you had proper authorization." "Who called?" "Didn't leave a name, just said they were from the Whitefish Ridge HOA and needed to verify your status." "What did you tell them?" "I told them exactly what's in the documentation we sent you. You're an official Forest Service volunteer. Your work is authorized and appreciated, and we have no concerns about your activities. I also mentioned that interfering with Forest Service volunteer programs is generally a bad idea. How did they respond? They hung up pretty quickly after that. I thanked Dave and hung up, feeling uneasy. Barbara was probing for weaknesses, looking for some angle to use against me. The community vote should have ended this, but clearly she was not ready to let it go. Friday afternoon, I got my answer. Another certified letter, this time not from the HOA but from a law firm in Kalispell. Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law. My hands were actually shaking as I opened it. Legal threats were now in play. The letter was surprisingly brief. It informed me that Morrison and Associates had been retained by the Whitefish Ridge Homeowners Association to pursue legal action regarding my ongoing violations of community covenants and bylaws. The letter demanded that I immediately cease all grooming activities and pay accumulated fines totaling $3,500 within 14 days, or face formal legal proceedings, including potential property liens and civil penalties. This was insane. We had just had a community vote. 2/3 of the neighborhood supported what I was doing. And now Barbara was escalating to lawyers. I called Frank immediately. He came over within 20 minutes, and we sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter. "She's bluffing," Frank said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. "That's a real law firm. I looked them up. They're legitimate." "Doesn't mean they have a case. You have Forest Service backing, you have community support, and you're not actually violating any legitimate bylaws. But fighting this in court will cost me thousands of dollars even if I win." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it's time to get our own lawyer. Not to go on the offensive, just to respond to this and make it clear you're not backing down." "I don't have thousands of dollars for legal fees, Frank." "Then we crowdfund it. The community supports you. Let people contribute to your legal defense. I guarantee you'll have more support than you expect." It was not a perfect solution, but it was something. Frank set up a crowdfunding page that evening, explaining the situation and asking for community support to help cover legal expenses. He shared it on the neighborhood social media pages and through email lists. By Sunday morning, the fund had raised over $8,000. People from the neighborhood and beyond, folks who used the trails and appreciated the work, contributed amounts ranging from $10 to $500. The outpouring was humbling and overwhelming. With the crowdfunding money, I was able to hire a lawyer of my own. Patricia Morrison, no relation to Dave, was a property rights attorney in Whitefish who specialized in HOA disputes. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and thorough, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting. "This is a slam-dunk case for you," she said when I finished. "The HOA is massively overreaching. They have no authority over activities conducted on federal land. The community has voted in your favor, and you have official federal recognition for your work. Barbara Hutchinson is either getting terrible legal advice or ignoring her own lawyer's recommendations. So, what do we do?" "I'll draft a response to their demand letter, outlining why their position is legally baseless and making it clear that any further harassment will result in counterclaims. I'll also request a full accounting of how the board is spending HOA funds, because hiring a lawyer to pursue this vendetta is probably not an authorized use of community money. Can we stop them from putting a lien on my house? If they try, we'll get an immediate injunction. But honestly, I doubt they'll push it that far once they realize you're serious about fighting back. Most HOA bullies fold when they meet real resistance." Patricia's response letter went out on Monday via certified mail to both the HOA board and Morrison and Associates. She copied me on it, and reading her crisp, professional dismantling of the HOA's position was deeply satisfying. The letter laid out the facts. My volunteer work was conducted on federal land under official Forest Service authorization. The community had voted overwhelmingly to support the work. None of my activities constituted legitimate bylaw violations, and the board's pursuit of this matter appeared to be a personal vendetta rather than legitimate HOA business. Patricia demanded that the HOA immediately withdraw all fines and threats, issue a formal apology, and provide documentation of how much in community funds had been spent on this dispute. She closed with a subtle threat. If the board continued its harassment, I would pursue legal action for abuse of process, misuse of HOA funds, and potentially personal liability for the board members involved. 2 days later, I received a terse email from Richard Turner. The board is meeting to discuss the situation. We will respond to your attorney's letter shortly. That was Wednesday. By Friday, I had heard nothing further. I continued grooming trails on my normal schedule, documenting every trip with photos and GPS logs just in case I needed evidence later. Saturday morning, I was out early grooming a section of trail that looped through a particularly scenic area of the national forest. The sun was just starting to paint the mountains pink and gold, and the only sounds were my snow machine and the occasional bird call. These were the moments I lived for, the reason I had moved to Montana in the first place. When I got back home around 11, there was a car I did not recognize in my driveway. Not Barbara's white SUV. This was a modest sedan with a government plate. A man in his 40s wearing a Forest Service uniform was standing on my porch. I did not recognize him, which was unusual since I knew most of the local rangers. "Henry Whitmore?" he asked as I approached. "That's me. I'm Marcus Chen, Regional Supervisor for Volunteer Programs. Jennifer Santos asked me to stop by and meet you in person." We shook hands, and I invited him inside. Over coffee, Marcus explained that the Forest Service had been following the dispute with my HOA. "This kind of thing is unfortunately not uncommon," Marcus said. "We have volunteers all over the region who face pushback from local authorities or property owners. Usually, it's because people don't understand that federal land management supersedes local rules. Is the Forest Service concerned about the legal issues?" "We're not concerned about your legal issues because you're in the right. What concerns us is that harassment from your HOA might discourage other volunteers from coming forward. The work you do is valuable, Henry. We want to make sure you can continue it without constant battles." "I appreciate that. My lawyer thinks the HOA will back down eventually." Marcus nodded. "Probably, but I wanted you to know that the Forest Service has your back on this. If needed, we can provide legal support through the federal system. It rarely comes to that, but the option exists." We talked for another hour about the trail system, improvements that could be made, and the possibility of expanding the volunteer program to include other areas. Marcus mentioned that several people had reached out to the Forest Service asking how they could help with trail maintenance, inspired by the publicity around my situation. After he left, I felt better about everything. The federal government was backing me, the community was backing me, and I had a good lawyer. Barbara's campaign was falling apart. Monday brought another certified letter, this time from the HOA board directly. I opened it expecting more threats, but instead found something completely different. The letter, signed by all 3 board members, stated that after careful review of community input and legal considerations, the board had decided to rescind all fines against me and withdraw their objections to my trail grooming activities. The letter emphasized that this decision was made in the best interest of community harmony and was not an admission of wrongdoing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that they had been wrong, just a bureaucratic retreat disguised as magnanimity. I called Patricia immediately. We won. I saw the letter. They caved completely, which is exactly what I expected. The threat of personal liability probably scared them. Board members can be held individually responsible if they misuse HOA funds for personal vendettas. So it's over. It's over. They won't bother you again. If they do, we have clear documentation of harassment that we can use. I called Frank next. He whooped with joy when I told him, "We're having a party. Tomorrow night, my place. Invite everyone who helped." The party was actually a great idea, a chance to thank everyone who had supported me through this absurd ordeal. Frank and Margaret went all out, setting up their house with food and drinks and inviting half the neighborhood. The evening turned into an impromptu celebration of community, with people sharing stories about their experiences on the trails, their frustrations with the HOA board, and their relief that common sense had prevailed. George Patterson gave a toast about standing up to petty tyrants. Sandra Kim's children presented me with a hand-drawn thank you card covered in crayon sketches of snow machines and trees. Even Tim Rodriguez, my quiet next-door neighbor, pulled me aside to say he was glad I had fought back. Barbara needed to be put in her place. She's been running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom for too long. As the party wound down and people started heading home, Frank and I stood on his back deck looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "You know what the best part of all this is?" Frank said. "It's not that you won. It's that you showed everyone that the board isn't untouchable. Barbara's been pushing people around for years, and nobody pushed back because it was easier to just comply. You changed that. I just wanted to groom trails, and that's exactly why you won. You weren't fighting for the sake of fighting. You were fighting for something real, something that mattered to people. That's always more powerful than someone fighting just to maintain control." The winter continued without further incident. I groomed trails twice a week, maintaining the network through February and March. Usage actually increased after all the publicity, with more families and outdoor enthusiasts discovering the trail system. In early April, as the snow began to melt and grooming season came to an end, Dave Morrison invited me to a recognition ceremony at the ranger station. The Forest Service presented me with a formal volunteer award for outstanding service, acknowledging over 300 hours of trail maintenance work during the winter season. Jennifer Santos had driven up from Missoula for the ceremony. She pulled me aside afterward. "You started something bigger than you realize, Henry. We've had 15 new volunteer applications for trail maintenance across the region since your story got out. People saw what you did and wanted to be part of it." "I was just maintaining trails," she smiled. "You were just maintaining trails. But you also stood up for the principle that public lands belong to everyone, and that volunteers who serve those lands deserve support and protection. That resonates with people." The award ceremony made the local news. A reporter from the Flathead Beacon interviewed me about the volunteer program and the dispute with the HOA. I kept my comments diplomatic, focusing on the trails and the community rather than the conflict. The article ran 2 days later with photos of me on my snow machine and quotes from Forest Service officials praising the volunteer program. Barbara Hutchinson declined to comment for the article. In May, the HOA held elections for board positions. Barbara ran for re-election as president. She lost in a landslide to George Patterson, who campaigned on transparency and community input. Donna Sheffield also lost her seat. Richard Turner chose not to run for re-election. The new board's first action was to formally recognize the trail system as a community amenity and to pass a resolution thanking me for my volunteer work. They also implemented new rules requiring community votes on any major decisions and restricting the board's ability to impose fines without clear violations. Frank was elected to the board as treasurer, replacing Richard. He called me the night the results came in, laughing. Guess who's now in charge of HOA finances? First thing I'm doing is reviewing how much Barbara spent on that lawyer. The community deserves to know. The accounting came out 2 weeks later. Barbara had spent over $4,000 in HOA funds pursuing legal action against me, all without getting approval from the community. The new board sent a formal demand to Barbara for reimbursement, citing misuse of community funds. She never paid it back. Instead, she put her house on the market and moved out of Whitefish Ridge by the end of summer. Rumor was she relocated to Bozeman, presumably to find a new neighborhood to torment. As summer turned to fall and fall turned back to winter, I prepared for another grooming season. My Snowmachine got a full maintenance overhaul. I built an improved grooming drag with better weight distribution, and I coordinated with the Forest Service on priority trails for the upcoming season. The first snow came in early November, earlier than usual. I was itching to get back out on the trails, to feel the cold air and the satisfaction of smooth, packed snow stretching behind me. On a crisp Saturday morning in mid-November, with 6 inches of fresh powder on the ground and more predicted, I fired up my Snowmachine and headed out. The trails were pristine, untouched since last season, waiting for maintenance. As I passed through the development, several neighbors waved from their driveways. Tim Rodriguez gave me a thumbs up. A couple I did not know well stood at the end of their driveway watching me go by, and they both smiled and waved. I reached the national forest boundary and accelerated, the grooming drag settling into its rhythm behind me. The sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. The trees were heavy with snow, the air was crisp and clear, and ahead of me stretched miles of trails waiting to be groomed. This was why I lived in Montana. This was why I did this work. Not because anyone made me, not for recognition or reward, but because it mattered. Because trails connected people to nature. Because maintained paths made the outdoors accessible. Because communities thrived when people contributed to something larger than themselves. The Forest Service appreciated me. The community supported me. The trails were open and waiting, and Barbara Hutchinson was gone, off to make someone else's life difficult in a different neighborhood. I settled into the rhythm of grooming, the familiar vibration of the Snowmachine beneath me, the satisfaction of watching smooth trail emerge behind the drag. This was going to be a good season. I could feel it. The trail stretched ahead into the forest, and I followed it forward into the winter morning, doing the work I loved in the place I called home. The HOA drama was behind me, forgotten like last season's snow. What remained was what had always mattered: the trails, the mountains, the community, and the simple satisfaction of work done well. 3 hours later, I completed the main loop and headed back toward home. On the trail, I passed a family with 2 young children on sleds, the kids shrieking with joy as they whooshed down a gentle hill. The parents waved and called out thanks. A group of cross-country skiers glided past in the opposite direction, their rhythmic pole plants creating a soft percussion against the snow. This was the point of everything. Not the conflict, not the drama, not the legal letters or the board meetings. This. People enjoying the outdoors, families making memories, a community connected to the public lands that surrounded it. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Frank walking over from his house. He had 2 cups of coffee in his hands, steam rising in the cold air. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing me one. "Perfect timing. Trails looking good, beautiful. Going to be a great season." We stood there in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and watching the mountains. The sun was fully up now, the sky a deep blue that only happened in winter. "You know," Frank said, "I've been thinking about getting a snow machine, maybe helping out with grooming. You could use a partner out there." I looked at him, surprised. "Seriously?" "Yeah, I use those trails all the time. Seems like I should contribute to maintaining them. Plus, it looks like fun." "It is fun. It's also cold early mornings and a lot of work. I'm retired. I've got time for cold and early mornings. And work that matters is never really work, right?" I grinned. "When do you want to start? Spring?" "Give me time to research equipment and get set up. By next season, you'll have backup." The idea of having a partner in the grooming work was unexpectedly appealing. It would make the maintenance easier, allow us to cover more trails, and provide backup when one of us was sick or traveling. More than that, it meant the trail system would continue even if something happened to me. The work would outlast any individual. "I'll help you get set up," I said. "We can coordinate with the Forest Service together." Frank raised his coffee cup. "To trails and telling HOA dictators to back off." I clinked my cup against his. "To trails and common sense prevailing." As winter deepened and the season progressed, the trail system thrived. Usage was up compared to previous years, partly because of all the publicity from the HOA dispute. People who had never known about the trails discovered them. Families who had been hesitant about winter outdoor activities found the groomed paths accessible and welcoming. Dave Morrison mentioned during one of our coordination calls that the Flathead National Forest was seeing record winter visitation in our area. He attributed it directly to the maintained trail system and the community engagement that had emerged from the conflict with Barbara. "Sometimes the best things come from the worst situations," Dave said. "Your fight with the HOA raised awareness about the trails and about the volunteer program. That's a net positive for everyone." In January, the Forest Service officially expanded the volunteer trail maintenance program, recruiting 3 additional volunteers to maintain trails in other parts of the national forest. They used my situation as a case study in their volunteer training, teaching people about their rights when facing opposition from local authorities or property owners. Jennifer Santos called to tell me about it. "You're famous in Forest Service volunteer circles now. People call it the Whitmore precedent. Federal volunteer status protects you from local interference when doing authorized work on federal land." I didn't mean to set a precedent. I just wanted to groom trails. The best precedents are always set by people who just wanted to do the right thing and refused to back down. By February, Frank had purchased his snow machine and grooming equipment. I spent several weekends training him on proper grooming techniques, trail navigation, and coordination with the Forest Service. He was a quick learner, and by March, we were alternating trail maintenance runs, effectively doubling the coverage and keeping the trails in pristine condition. The season ended in late April as temperatures warmed and the snow began its final melt. Frank and I did a last maintenance run together, knowing it would be the final grooming of the season. As we finished and prepared to pack away the equipment for the summer, Frank turned to me with a serious expression. "I want you to know that what you did, fighting back against Barbara, it changed things for a lot of people in this neighborhood. Not just about the trails, but about standing up for what's right even when it's hard. People are less afraid now. The new board actually listens to residents. The whole dynamic is different. I was just defending something I cared about. Yeah, but most people wouldn't have done it. Most people would have given up when the legal threats started, when the fines piled up, when it got expensive and complicated. You didn't give up. That matters. I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We packed up our equipment in companionable silence, already looking forward to next season. Summer arrived with its own routines. I hiked the trails without snow, checking for maintenance needs and planning improvements for the following winter. The Forest Service asked me to consult on trail design for a new winter recreation area they were developing in a different part of the national forest. I spent several weekends that summer working with rangers to lay out trails and plan access points. In September, the new HOA board organized a community appreciation event, a neighborhood barbecue with awards for residents who had contributed to the community. They presented me with a plaque thanking me for the trail maintenance work and for standing up for community values and outdoor access. George Patterson, the new HOA president, gave a short speech. Henry showed us that one person standing up for what's right can change everything. He faced legal threats, financial pressure, and harassment, but he never backed down. The trails we all enjoy exist because he fought for them. That's the kind of community member we should all aspire to be. The applause was genuine and warm. I felt embarrassed by the attention but also grateful for the support. This community had rallied around me when it mattered most, and that was not something I would forget. As fall turned to winter and the first snows began to fall, I found myself eagerly anticipating another grooming season. Frank and I had our equipment ready, our coordination system refined, and the Forest Service had even provided us with upgraded radios for safety communication. The first real snow came in early December. Frank and I met at dawn on a Saturday, fired up our snow machines, and headed out together. The trails awaited, fresh and pristine, ready for another season of maintenance and use. As we worked our way through the trail system, falling into the rhythm of grooming that I had come to love, I thought about everything that had happened. The conflict with Barbara felt like ancient history now, a temporary storm that had ultimately made everything stronger. The trails were better maintained, the volunteer program had expanded, and the community was more engaged. Sometimes you had to fight for things that mattered. Sometimes standing your ground cost time and money and energy. But when the fight was over and you looked at what you had protected, what you had built, what you had preserved for others to enjoy, it was worth every difficult moment. The winter sun climbed higher as we worked, painting the snow in brilliant whites and deep shadows. The forest was quiet except for the sound of our snow machines and the occasional crack of a branch shedding its snow load. Miles of trail stretched ahead, waiting for maintenance, waiting for the families and skiers and outdoor enthusiasts who would use them throughout the season. I had moved to Montana 15 years ago looking for something real, something meaningful beyond the corporate grind of city life. I had found it in these mountains, in this community, in the simple act of maintaining trails for others to enjoy. Barbara Hutchinson had tried to take that away, tried to impose her petty authority over something that benefited everyone. She had failed because communities are stronger than dictators, because federal law protects volunteers doing important work, and because sometimes people find the courage to stand up and say no. The trail stretched ahead, smooth and perfect behind our grooming drags. Frank gave me a thumbs up from his snow machine. I returned the gesture and accelerated forward into the winter morning, doing the work I loved in the place I called home, grateful for every moment of it.